So we're gonna do something a little different now. Imagine that, go back to some of your favorite college moments, talking to the people, your closest friends who you think are just the most interesting people you've ever met, and you're up late at night talking for hours and hours about ideas and figuring out how those ideas link together. And then imagine that you stay friends with some of those people for 30 years, and then one day someone calls you and says, hey, you get to go on stage with one of your oldest friends who's now turned into this brilliant data scientist and talk about unintended consequences of technology and try to spark a conversation. So we're going to try to let you in on a conversation that in one way or another we've been having for decades when I had all this hair and his was a different color. So Eric called me maybe 2 months ago or so and clued me in on this problem that he's been increasingly obsessed with, which is that there is an awareness, there is a public awareness and also a policy awareness that maybe the machines are getting a little ahead of us, and maybe the algorithms are getting a little ahead of us, and do we need legislation here? But it turns out, we think that maybe they're focusing in on the wrong problems, or the ones they've focused in on most aggressively are missing some of the more interesting problems. Namely, you see this GDPR framework in Europe that is really actually very intelligently focusing in on privacy, right? And personal rights to your own information and personal control. But what we're seeing, or what Eric's seeing, and now I'm seeing through him, is a whole bunch of examples of actually us getting exploited not as individuals, but as classes of people. And that isn't really being looked at least on a policy level yet. So we want to talk about that, give a couple of examples, hopefully start a conversation here. We think we've got maybe an idea of a solution, but we're going to poke holes in our own solution, and hopefully you guys can help improve that over the course of the day.
Right. So yeah, I approached Dave in part, well, I'm a data scientist, as you mentioned. My background is ecology, but I had a data science company that was acquired by a large e-commerce company. And suddenly I found myself in this world of mining personal data for market research purposes. And I became obsessed with tracking what's happening with the privacy legislation, excuse me, and also all these updated privacy policies, and they say, oh, your privacy is important to us. We anonymize your data and we aggregate it, and we nobody knows who you are, you're de-identified and everything. And at the same time, reading all these headlines of what people have been talking about, just about discrimination through algorithms and around Russian targeting of political messaging on Facebook, and all these are data problems. But privacy isn't the problem. And I was realizing this discrepancy between the emphasis on privacy and on individual rights around data, and the right to know what's collected about you and to control that, versus the societal outcomes of those, the way the data are used. So, for example, if I want to spread conspiracy theories on Facebook, I don't need to know anybody's identity. Everybody's identity is totally protected. All I need to know is that there's a class of people who are particularly vulnerable to a certain kind of messaging. And their identity is protected, and they've consented to give all this information to receive relevant information and relevant ads. And the problem isn't privacy, it's profiling. So I approached Dave because he's not only an award-winning writer, because I said, we need to write a piece about this and just get some ideas out and try to test these ideas. I approached him because he wrote a book in 1997, 1 year before Google was invented, Google was born, that was called Data Smog. It was about information overload, and it really foreshadowed a lot of, it's very relevant today. It was about this thing called the internet and some unintended consequences around it. He also started a now defunct website called Technorealism that was trying to foster ideas around just thinking critically about the consequences of technology. So I was like, Dave, we should revive this technorealism thing and try to communicate some things around unintended consequences of personal data.
Let's say that Google it was inspired by my book. Let's just say the timeline is there, so let's just put that out there. It'll become a meme.
Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about, before we float our solution to this problem, let's give a couple of good examples of this problem. What's your favorite example of how we're being exploited as classes of people as opposed to personal?
Well, actually, I'm just going to give you one random example that happened to me this morning on the way in. I was sitting on the BART, and I'm sitting next to somebody who is apparently low income, overweight, African-American male. And I just happened to be watching like what he's looking at on his phone, and he's listening to some music on YouTube. And all these ads are popping up to him on his thing for Jack in the Box and specials at Jack in the Box and offers. And I'm on my phone, and I'm getting ads for free online courses for machine learning, or sustainably sourced, I don't know, wool slippers or something like that. And the thing is that there's nothing about privacy going on here. There's nothing about anybody's rights being violated in that way. It's about people being put into buckets and then being presented with certain kinds of messaging or not being presented with certain opportunities based on those buckets. If you look at recently, Facebook just got accused of bias in sexual discrimination in job ad placement. And again, that's something where historic data on who tended to have this particular kind of job tended to be white men, meant that the algorithms placed those ads in front of the same kind of people, which means that certain people don't get those ads or those opportunities, not because their privacy was breached, but because they were put in a bucket that meant that they don't get certain kinds of opportunities and certain kinds of offers.
So to let you know how spontaneous and real this conversation is, I had not heard the example of him on BART until about 15 seconds ago on stage. So let's talk that through for a second. So we have a guy who, if GDPR is fully in place for this guy and he has control over his own privacy, so that no one is releasing his name or his private information, his address and so forth, that doesn't do anything about him being targeted in this way.
Right.
And even if he has control over exactly what information about him is being released, that doesn't really give him the power to not be exploited by all these ads, right?
Correct, yeah. And the thing is, it's not even about these individual cases, it's about how they scale up to, nobody gets to see a map of like, what are all the zip codes of who got Jack in the Box ads and who got free machine learning courses ads, right? Nobody sees the map. Nobody sees the distribution of incomes or race or ethnicity or gender or anything else. We don't get to see those data. So some people have rightfully brought out issues around algorithmic transparency. So Cathy O'Neill wrote a book called Weapons of Math Destruction. She just gave a great talk on the TED main stage last year about how the algorithms that make decisions need to be more transparent. But this is not about algorithmic transparency, it's about outcomes. We don't have to understand how the algorithms are working to see that the outcomes are racist or sexist or discriminating against vulnerable people.
So what we have is all these very powerful corporations who are trying to make money and coming up with algorithms and actual machines, technologies that are out there trying to sell their stuff, exploit people commercially, which is what kind of their job.
Right.
And then on the other side we have all these individuals who are being exploited, but privacy isn't the way to protect them against that exploitation. So what is the way to empower the individuals and the classes of individuals?
Right, yeah.
That's what we've been trying to think about. And so the first thing we did was we tried to look at what the analogs are. Where are there other where are there other potentially exploitative situations where where people in the past have and institutions in the past have come up with ways to look for bias, look for exploitation, protect the people who are potentially being exploited. And Eric had a great example, which is that in his kind of former life as a scientist, as a real biological scientist, he would do all these studies, and you'd have to submit them to an internal review board. Is it IRB?
Institutional Review Board, yeah.
Right.
So as an academic, if you do any research on human subjects, whether it's like medical clinical trials, or we did a large study on human creativity, you have to get approval from an ethical review board that evaluates the balance between the benefits to society of the work you're doing relative to the potential risks to people who might be vulnerable who by participating or through the consequences of your work. And now that I'm working in a company where I'm just mining personal data for targeted advertising and market research, there is no review board that says, have you considered some potential groups of vulnerable people that might be negatively influenced by this work? There is no review board. If you want to, and you brought the example actually of the FDA.
Right.
So same thing with medicine. If you want to put a new drug on the market, you have to go through a review that you evaluate. There's a framework for this, for evaluating what are the risks to society relative to the benefits, and how do we weigh those.
Right. So, and this is, if we can come up with analogs to this in the technology world, this is going to be good for the people who are being exploited. It's also going to be good for the companies, right? Because the companies don't want to find out that they are unduly exploiting people in this maybe semi-criminal way by reading the front page of the New York Times. They don't want it to get to that level. In the same way, the people don't want to get so exploited that they are being that their lives are being upended, before they rise up and protest and call the New York Times. So what way is there, either internally or slightly external to the company, where there can be some sort of review officer, review board, maybe some sort of combination, maybe a community review among in this industry or in these various kind of micro industries, where they're looking at the outcomes, not just the intentions of these algorithms and machines, but the actual outcomes of how this facial recognition, for example, is it biased, and how is it biased, before it's actually being released, or in the earliest stages, so that it can be corrected before it becomes a legitimate scandal.
Yeah, I think, and one thing that we realized was that once the European data protection laws came about, any company that works with personal data has to have a dedicated data protection officer. At the company I work at now, they have a chief privacy officer. It's happening, and also the GDPR is an external, I guess not review, but it's a place for accountability and action if people violate the policies. But there is a precedent for it, and when I spoke with the chief privacy officer at my company, I realized that she's a lawyer focused on compliance around privacy issues and protection, which is great because it needs to happen. But there is no chief ethics officer. There is no social scientist or historian who's in the C-suite. They're all business people and former engineers who are trying to optimize what we're doing and make money. So there is nobody there to review what are some potential unintended ethical consequences, again, for the good of the company, because nobody wants those headlines.
And now we have 77 seconds to throw out a couple of solutions. So we're thinking an algorithm review officer inside the company, or like there's a Better Business Bureau outside the company, but kind of forming, policing the community, maybe an algorithm review board in a Better Business Bureau kind of institution where the companies
and all that needs really is just access to aggregated, anonymized data on outcomes. It doesn't have to be anything that breaches anybody's privacy or everything. It's really just looking at aggregated data on outcomes. When we put ads on Facebook and see where they go, we never get to see bigger picture patterns of who actually got to serve the ads, what is the distribution of incomes and ethnicities and whatever, and who got the ads and who clicked through. Are there some of those people particularly vulnerable because their estimated income to spend to income ratio is really high? Like all that stuff is there. It's easy to gather and it's easy to make available.
And ideally, as we said, this works for both the people potentially being exploited and for the company, and it intervenes long before there's a scandal. So this could be a win-win situation. We hope that
and part of this, we've just been trying to think out these ideas. I approached Dave to help try to write a little op-ed piece about it, and then we thought, well, why don't we just test out some of the ideas here, and hopefully we've got the day and evening to get your guys' input and feedback about it.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
Thanks so much.